but rather you eat this lamb fully dressed, ready at any moment, as it were, at the drop of a hat, to leave. You have your staff in your hand, you have your loins girded, and you're eating this lamb with particular side dishes, bitter herbs, which remind you of the bitter bondage of Egypt. Unleavened bread. 2 reasons for the unleavened bread. First of all, you have no time on this first Passover evening to leaven your bread. You're eating it in a hurry. You have no time to make bread in the normal way. And second, leaven is a symbol of corruption, and that's why they have the feast of unleavened bread around the same time as the Passover feast. And that will be your last meal before you enter the wilderness. Roast lamb, bitter herbs, unleavened bread. You will be strengthened by this lamb, therefore, for your journey. And then you enter into the wilderness on the way to Canaan. And all of that is included in that phrase in our text, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. You might be wondering why all of those tedious details. Why keep the Passover? What exactly is the significance of this Passover? Well, first of all, look at the name Passover. That means literally to leap over, to pass by, and hence to spare. And to spare someone is to refrain from punishing him. And that verb to pass over is used in Isaiah 31 verse 5, where we have this wonderful promise of God. As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending also he will deliver it, and passing over he will preserve it. The idea then is protection and preservation and sparing of Moses and the Israelites by means of the blood of the Passover lamb. Because the people of God, the Israelites, had to understand that they deserved to perish on that night just as much as the ungodly Egyptians did. They too are sinners. And for them, there is only one hope, that God will accept a substitute in their place. God could therefore have destroyed them, and would have been perfectly just to do so. But God loved Moses, and God loved his people Israel, and he did not desire to destroy them. And so he gives them the Passover as a picture of what he does in Jesus Christ in sparing his people from everlasting punishment in hell. And he did not make any provision for the Egyptians. They were not spared. They perish without mercy. That's the significance of the Passover then. It is a sparing of the people of God. But God cannot simply spare Israel because he loves them. There must be a righteous reason, a righteous basis for this sparing. And that is found in the blood of the Lamb. God will not simply overlook the sin of Moses and the sin of all of the Israelites. He is righteous, and these sinners deserve to be punished. And God's righteousness and justice, they must be satisfied. He does not spare them then simply because of their birth into the nation of Israel, but rather he demands the satisfaction of his justice, and in his mercy he gives a substitute to stand in their place, who is the Lamb of God himself, Jesus Christ, the seed of the woman, the seed of Abraham, the one who would deliver Israel for good from all of their sins. That's why the lamb must be a very specific lamb. That's why it must be a lamb without blemish. That's why it must be a male lamb of the first year. All of the details of the Passover lamb are fulfilled exactly in Jesus Christ and his work on the cross. A lamb was selected, and that lamb was selected by God himself before the foundation of the world. Jesus Christ, we are told, is the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And that lamb was tested and it was scrutinized by the people. And they looked upon him and they saw him, they heard him, they watched him carefully. And after those years of his public ministry, they could find no fault in him. And nor could Pilate. And that lamb then was killed publicly by the people as a body. The entire congregation said, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And he was led away to be put to death by the Romans. And Christ died not as an old man, but as a man in the prime of his life, at the height of his physical strength. And he died at the Passover feast in Jerusalem, between the evenings of the 13th and the 14th days of the first month. And as the lamb was entirely roasted by the fire, and nothing was left raw, so Christ was entirely consumed by the wrath of God. But not even a bone of him was broken. And no wonder then Paul can write in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7, "For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us." There's another significance of the Passover, and that's given to us at the beginning of Exodus chapter 12. It marks the beginning of Israel as a nation. And it would therefore be celebrated as a lasting memorial by the Israelites. Notice that this is such a monumental feast that their calendar is changed. How do you mark the new calendar of the Jews? The first month. That's when the Passover feast will be celebrated. Most likely, when they lived in Egypt, they used the Egyptian calendar. But at the time of the Passover, and going out of Egypt into the wilderness, they have a new calendar. And the first month of their year is Passover month. And they would remember year after year this great deliverance that God had given them through the Passover, through destroying the firstborn of Egypt and sparing them that punishment which they deserved by giving unto them the blood of the Passover lamb. They must never, ever forget this. And God tells them they must remind their children of it. Verse 26, "And it shall come to pass when your children shall say unto you, What mean ye by this service? Why the lamb? Why the bitter herbs? What are you doing exactly, Mommy and Daddy?" You will say to them, "It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses." That's what you must tell the children year after year. God was merciful. God delivered us from Egypt. God destroyed the Egyptians. God rescued us. Remember, what is in mind here, in view here in our text, is not the annual feast of the Passover, but rather the very first Passover. Because only once did they sprinkle blood upon the doorposts. And only once did God smite the firstborn of the Egyptians. Only once did they leave Egypt with all the spoils of the Egyptians. It was a night they would never forget. They would celebrate it, they would sing about it, they would worship God for it, and they would live in thankfulness to God for it the rest of their days. Our text tells us that Moses did all this, the keeping of the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, by faith. By faith. And just think for a moment what God was asking him to do and what God had promised to give unto him. It appeared to be foolish. Imagine the scene of the first Passover. Strange things are happening in Goshen, in Egypt. The Israelites have all gathered together in the evening, and they're all slaughtering lambs. Enough lambs to feed every household in Goshen. And now the Israelites are taking hyssop brushes and brushing blood all over their doorposts. And now we can smell roast lamb wafting through the windows of all of these households. And the Egyptians must have thought, what in the world are those Israelites up to? And you can imagine a conversation going something like this. What are you doing? Oh, well, we have just slaughtered our lambs, and now we are daubing blood all over our doorposts because God told us to do this, and we're going to eat our roast lamb because our God has told us that at midnight we are going to leave Egypt. And our God has told us that at midnight He's going to kill all of your firstborn. All of your firstborn, including your beasts. But we do not worry, we do not fear, because our God has told us, and we believe Him, that as this destroying angel comes through the land of Egypt, He's going to pass over us. He will see the blood upon our doorposts, and He will not come in and destroy us. That's why we're killing all these lambs. That's why we're putting blood on our doorposts. That's why we're preparing to have roast lamb this evening. We believe that is our salvation. And the Egyptians probably thought that these Israelites are crazy. But Moses believed the promise of God. And Moses obeyed what God told him to do. Moses may not have fully understood all of the details of this feast. He might not fully have understood why it is that blood is going to save him, and he puts it upon the doorpost of his houses. But he believed that that is exactly what would happen. And no believer in the promise of God, and certainly not Moses, went to bed that night. They all sat up in eager anticipation of what God was going to do. And you can imagine them all sitting there, eating their Passover feast in a kind of eerie silence as midnight approaches. What's going to happen? What's it going to be like? God has said we're going to be delivered at midnight. It would be a wonderful deliverance for Israel. And just think, if nothing had happened that night, how foolish it would have looked in the morning. And what would they have said to the Egyptians the next day if nothing had happened? And there they are. They've killed all their lambs. They've eaten their roast lamb, and they're all the same as they were before. They're all still slaves.